Officer Jerry, a strict cop, arrested a 9-year-old black girl confident he was just doing his job. But 10 minutes later, karma hits in a way he never saw coming. What unfolded next set off a chain of events that turned his entire life upside down. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Jerry patrolled the quiet streets of Maple Grove, his keen eyes scanning every corner and alleyway. The weight of his badge felt heavy on his chest, a constant reminder of his duty to protect and serve. But for Jerry, that duty came with a strict adherence to the rules. No exceptions, no excuses. As he walked his beat, Jerry's mind drifted back to his childhood. Growing up in a working-class family, he had seen firsthand how tough life could be. There were times when his own family had relied on community charities to get by, but those memories were long buried, replaced by his unwavering belief in law and order. Jerry prided himself on being a no-nonsense cop. He didn't have time for SOB stories or second chances in his mind. The law was black and white, and it was his job to enforce it. Without question, his colleagues often joked that he could recite the entire police handbook in his sleep. As he turned onto Oak Street, Jerry noticed a group of teenagers loitering near the corner store. His eyes narrowed, suspicion immediately creeping into his thoughts. He quickened his pace, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his belt. "All right, break it up," he called out, his voice stern and authoritative. The teens looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. "What's going on here?" One of the boys stepped forward, a nervous smile on his face. "Nothing, officer. We're just hanging out." Jerry's eyes scanned the group, looking for any sign of trouble. He didn't trust their inept act for a second. In his experience, groups of kids always meant trouble. "I don't want to see any loitering," he said firmly. "Move along now," as the teenagers shuffled away. Casting wary glances over their shoulders, Jerry felt a sense of satisfaction. He had nipped potential trouble in the bud, just as he always did in his mind, assuming the worst was the best way to keep the peace, as Officer Jerry continued his patrol. The scene shifted to the bustling grocery store just a few blocks away. Inside the store, their 9-year-old Natalie stood hand in hand with her mother Caroline as they navigated the crowded aisles. Natalie's big brown eyes sparkled with curiosity as she took in the colorful displays of fruits and vegetables. Her long, dark hair was neatly tied back in a ponytail, swinging gently as she walked. She wore her favorite blue sundress, a small chocolate stain on the hem from the candy bar she had enjoyed earlier. "Mommy, can we get strawberries?" Natalie asked, her voice soft and sweet. Carolyn smiled down at her daughter, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Of course, sweetie. They're on the list." As they made their way through the store, Caroline noticed how packed it was. The checkout lines stretched far, and people were bumping into each other in the narrow AES. She glanced at her watch, realizing she still had quite a bit of shopping to do. "Nat, honey," Caroline said, kneeling down to meet her daughter's eyes. "It's really crowded in here. Would you mind waiting for me outside by the entrance? I'll be quicker if I finish up on my own." Natalie nodded, her eyes wide, with understanding. "Okay, Mommy, I'll be good, and stay right by the door." Caroline smiled, touching her daughter's cheek affectionately. "That's my girl here," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small pack of crackers. "You can have these while you wait. I won't be long, I promise." Natalie took the crackers, her face lighting up. "Thank you, Mommy." Carolyn watched as Natalie skipped towards the store's entrance, her little sundress swishing around her knees. She felt a twinge of worry, as any mother would, but she knew Natalie was a responsible child. Plus, the store was in a safe neighborhood, and she would only be a few minutes. Natalie found a spot near the entrance, just as her mother had asked. She sat down on a small bench, swinging her legs. As she punched on her crackers, she watched the people coming and going, smiling shyly at those who caught her eye. Natalie sat patiently on the small bench outside the grocery store, and from time to time wandering the sides of the grocery while he nibbled on her crackers. The sun warmed her face, and she watched with curious eyes As people bustled in and out of the store, she clutched her little snack, careful not to drop any crumbs on her yellow sundress, as Natalie waited. Officer Jerry's patrol car rolled slowly down the street. His sharp eyes scanned the area, always on the lookout for anything out of the ordinary. When he spotted the young girl walking alone by the store entrance, his brow furrowed with suspicion. Jerry pulled his car to a stop across the street. Watching Natalie intently, he noticed the snack in her hand and how she seemed to be looking around nervously in Jerry's mind. This all added up to potential trouble. Probably shoplifting, he muttered to himself, his jaw set in a hard line, or loying at the very least. Without hesitation, Jerry stepped out of his patrol car and strode purposefully across the street. His hand rested instinctively on his belt as he approached Natalie. His face stern and unyielding, Natalie looked up as the officer's shadow fell over her. Her eyes widened with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She had always been taught that police officers were there to help, but something about Officer Jerry's expression made her feel uneasy. "Excuse me, young lady." Jerry said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "What are you doing here all alone?" Natalie swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a timid whisper. "I'm waiting for my mommy, sir. She's inside shopping." Jerry's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the snack in Natalie's hand. "And where did you get that?" he demanded, pointing at the crackers. Natalie's lower lip trembled slightly as she answered, "My mommy gave them to me, sir, to eat while I wait." Officer Jerry didn't seem convinced. He crossed his arms, looming over the small girl. "Are you sure about that? You didn't take it from the store without paying?" Tears began to well up in Natalie's eyes as she shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. I promise my mommy gave them to me." Jerry's suspicion grew with each passing moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that this young girl was to no good. Without a second thought, he decided to take action. "All right, that's enough," Jerry said sternly, his voice cutting through the air. "I think you've been stealing from the store, young lady." Natalie's eyes widened in shock and confusion. But I didn't," she stammered, her voice trembling. Jerry didn't give her a chance to explain. He reached out and grasped Natalie's arm firmly. "You're coming with me," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. Natalie burst into tears, her small body shaking with fear. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong," she cried, her words coming out in a jumble. "My mommy, she's inside, please." But Jerry wasn't listening. He was too focused on what he believed to be right, too convinced of his own assumptions to hear the truth in Natalie's pleas. As Jerry began to lead Natalie away, a small crowd started to gather. People stopped in their tracks, watching the scene unfold with a mix of concern and curiosity. "What's going on?" someone whispered. "Is that little girl in trouble?" another asked. Natalie's sobs grew louder as Jerry pulled her towards his patrol car. She tried to explain again, her words coming out between hiccups and tears. "Please, I'm just waiting, my mommy." But Jerry remained unmoved. Moved. He opened the back door of his patrol car, preparing to place Natalie inside. The crowd grew larger, murmurs of disbelief and concern rippling through the onlookers. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Natalie's cries echoed through the air, her small form trembling as Jerry lifted her into the car. The snack she had been holding fell to the ground, forgotten in the chaos of the moment Caroline emerged from the grocery store, her arms laden with bags. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for Natalie. What she saw made her heart stop. There, just a few feet away, stood her little girl in handcuffs. Natalie's face was streaked with tears, her small body shaking with sobs. A police officer loomed over her, his hand on her shoulder. "Natalie!" Caroline cried out. Dropping her bags without a second thought, she rushed towards her daughter, her mind reeling with shock and confusion. "What's happening here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Why is my daughter in handcuffs?" Officer Jerry turned to face Caroline, his expression stern. "Ma'am, I caught this young lady stealing from the store," he stated matter of lie. Caroline's eyes widened in disbelief. Stealing, that's impossible. She was waiting for me while I finished shopping. Natalie looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with tears. Mommy, I didn't do anything wrong, she whimpered. I told him I was waiting for you, but he wouldn't listen. Caroline's anger flared. She turned to Jerry, her eyes blazing. How dare you? My daughter is innocent. She would never steal. Jerry stood his ground, unmoved by Caroline's fury. I was just doing my job, ma'am. I saw a suspicious situation and acted accordingly. Suspicious. Caroline spat out the word. She's a 9-year-old girl waiting for her mother. There's nothing suspicious about that. The crowd around on them grew larger, people whispering and pointing. Caroline noticed some had their phones out recording the scene. Take these handcuffs off my daughter right now, Caroline demanded, her voice shaking with rage. This is completely unacceptable. Jerry hesitated, looking from Caroline to Natalie. And back again, ma'am. I understand you're upset, but I have procedures to follow. Caroline stepped closer to Jerry, her eyes locked on his. Your procedures. Your procedures lead you to handcuff an innocent child without even trying to understand the situation. Is this really how you do your job? Carolina's face flushed with anger as she stared down Officer Jerry. The crowd around them grew larger, their murmurs of disapproval growing louder by the second. You can't just go around arresting children without cause, Caroline shouted, her voice trembling with rage. What kind of police officer does that? Jerry shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the onlookers. He could feel their judging eyes on him, but he refused to back down. Ma'am, I was following protocol when I see suspicious activity. Suspicious activity, Caroline cut him off. She's a little girl eating a snack. How is that suspicious? A woman in the crowd spoke up. That's right. I saw her waiting here earlier. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Jerry's jaw tightened. He knew he'd made a mistake, but admitting it felt impossible. Look, I'm just trying to keep our community safe, he said stiffly, by terrorizing innocent children. Caroline shot back. She knelt down beside Natalie, who was still sobbing quietly. It's okay, sweetie, Mommy's here now. Jerry watched the tender moment between mother and daughter, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but he quickly pushed it aside. I was doing my job, he insisted. Caroline stood up, her eyes blazing. Your job is to protect and serve, not to bully and intimidate. I'm filing a formal complaint against you. Officer, this kind of behavior is unacceptable. The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone shouted, yeah, he should be ashamed of himself. Jerry's face reneged, but he stood his ground. You have the right to file a complaint. Ma'am, but I stand by my actions. Oh, you can bet I'll be filing that complaint. Caroline said, her voice low and danger, and I won't stop there. I'll make sure everyone knows how you treat innocent children in this community. She turned to the crowd. Did anyone get this on video? Because I'm going to need evidence of this officer's misconduct. Several people nodded, holding up their phones. Jerry's eyes widened as he realized just how badly this situation had spiraled out of control. Caroline turned back to Jerry. Her eyes narrowed. Now, are you going to take these handcuffs off my daughter? Or do I need to call your supervisor? Jerry stormed into the police station, his face set in a grim line. He marched straight to his desk, ignoring the curious glances from his fellow officers. As he sat down, he let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. I was just doing my job, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in his gut. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget the little girl, tearful face, or her mother's furious words. He reached for a stack of paperwork, determined to lose himself in the mundane tasks of his job. But before he could even pick up his pen, a voice called out across the station, Officer, Jerry the Chief wants to see you in his office now. Jerry's head snapped up, his brow furrowing. It wasn't like the chief to call him in so abruptly. With a growing sense of dread, he pushed back from his desk and made his way to the chief office. As he entered, Jerry immediately noticed the stern expression on his superior's face. The chief gestured for him to sit down, his lips pressed into a thin line. Jerry, we've got a problem, the chief said, his voice grave. A formal complaint has been filed against you for racial profiling. Jerry's mouth fell open in shock. What but I? The chief held up a hand, cutting him off the incident at the grocery store this afternoon. The mother of the girl you arrested has filed a complaint, and it's serious. Jerry, very serious. Jerry felt his face grow hot. Chief, I was just following protocol. I saw suspicious activity, and you arrested a 9-year-old girl without proper cause. The chief finished for him, his voice sharp. Jerry, you're under investigation. Effective. Immediately. The words hit Jerry like a physical blow. He sat there stunned as the chief continued to XP the process. But Jerry barely heard him. His mind was reeling, trying to process how quickly everything had fallen apart. As he left the chief's office, Jerry felt like he was walking in a daze. The station suddenly seemed too loud, too bright. He stumbled back to his desk, collapsing into his chair. How did this happen? He whispered to himself, staring blankly at his computer screen for the first time in his career. Jerry found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about being a good cop. As the days passed, Jerry's world began to crumble around him. The investigation into the incident at the grocery store moved forward relentlessly, leaving him suspended from duty and stripped of his badge. The station that had once felt like a second home now seemed cold and unwelcoming. Jerry sat at his kitchen table staring at the morning newspaper. The headline glared back at him. Local officer under investigation for racial profiling. He pushed the paper away, his stomach churning. This is ridiculous, he muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I was just doing my job. How can they not see that? But deep down, a small voice nagged at him. Was he really just doing his job? Or had he jumped to conclusions based on what Jerry shook his head, refusing to entertain the thought at the station? Things weren't much better when Jerry stopped by to pick up some personal items. He noticed how his colleagues averted their eyes or suddenly found urgent tasks to attend to. Officer Martinez, who he'd considered a friend, barely managed a nod before hurrying away. Hey, Martinez, Jerry called out, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Want to grab a coffee later? Martinez paused, looking uncomfortable. Sorry, Jerry. I've got stuff to do. Maybe another time. As Jerry watched his colleagues retreating back, the weight of his isolation settled heavily on his shoulders. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, on following the rules to keep people safe. How had that landed him here at home? Jerry paced his living room, replaying the incident in his mind for the 800th time. The little girl's face, tear-stained and frightened, kept flashing before his eyes. But each time he pushed the image away, clinging desperately to his conviction. I saw suspicious activity. He told his empty apartment any good cop would have done the same thing. It had nothing to do with. But he couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. The possibility that his actions might have been racially motivated was too much to bear. It went against everything he thought he stood for. As night fell, Jerry found himself sitting in the dark, the weight of his choices pressing down on him despite the evidence mounting. Against him, he clung to his denial like a lifeline. It was easier than facing the truth about himself and the consequences of his actions. That night, Carolyn sat on the edge of Natalie's bed, gently stroking her daughter's hair. Natalie's eyes were still puffy from crying, and she clutched her favorite stuffed animal tightly to her chest. Mommy, why did that policeman think I was bad? Natalie asked, her voice small and trembling. Caroline's heart ached at the innocence in her daughter's question. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her anger in check for Natalie's sake. Sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. That officer made a big mistake, and we're going to make sure he knows it. Natalie nodded, but Caroline could see the confusion and hurt still lingering in her eyes. She pulled her daughter close, wrapping her in a warm hug. Listen to me, Natalie, Caroline said softly but firmly. You are a good girl, and what happened wasn't your fault. We're going to fight for justice. Okay, Mommy's going to make sure that officer learns he can't treat people this way. As Natalie drifted off to sleep, Caroline quietly left the room. Her determination growing with each step in the kitchen, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd been given by a friend. "Hello. Is this the office of Johnson and Associates?" Caroline asked when someone answered. "I need to speak with a lawyer about filing a formal complaint against a police officer." Over the next hour, Caroline explained the situation to the lawyer, her voice shaking with emotion as she recounted the details of Jerry's actions and Natalie's distress. "We start the process immediately," the lawyer assured her. "What happened to your daughter is unacceptable, and we'll do everything we can to hold this officer accountable." After hanging up, Caroline felt a mix of relief and renewed anger. She was glad to be taking action. But the memory of Natalie and handcuffs still made her blood boil. She walked to the window looking out at the quiet street. "We won't let this go." "Jerry," she whispered, her hands clenching into fists, "you're going to learn that you can't just hurt innocent children and walk away the next day." Jerry sat in his car outside the community center, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The order to attend sensitivity training felt like a slap in the face. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, realizing he couldn't put it off any longer. With a heavy sigh, he got out of the car and trudged towards the building. Each step felt like a personal defeat. As he reached for the door handle, he muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job." Inside the room was filled with a mix of people, some in uniform, others in casual clothes. Jerry found a seat at the back. Crossing his arms over his chest, he scanned the faces around him, feeling a surge of resentment in his mind. He didn't belong here with officers who had actually done something wrong. The instructor, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, began the session. "Welcome, everyone. We're here to learn about community relations and sensitivity in our work." Jerry rolled his eyes, barely suppressing a scoff. He tuned out most of the introduction, his mind wandering to the incident with Natalie. He still couldn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal out of it. Suspicion was part of the job, wasn't it? As the session progressed, Jerry found himself becoming more and more defensive. Every scenario presented, every discussion point raised, seemed to be a personal attack on his judgment and his career. "Remember," the instructor said, "our goal is to serve and protect all members of our community regardless of age, race, or background." Jerry felt his face grow hot. He wanted to stand up and shout that he already knew all this, that he didn't need to be here, but he bit his tongue. Knowing that causing a scene would only make things worse during a group exercise, Jerry reluctantly participated. Giving short, clipped responses, his fellow trainees noticed his attitude, exchanging glances and keeping their distance as the session came to an end. Jerry felt drained and irritated. He couldn't shake the feeling that this whole ordeal was unfair in his mind. He was a good cop who had made a split-second decision based on years of experience. Why couldn't anyone see that as Jerry sat through the first half of the sensitivity training? His frown deepened with each passing minute. The instructor, a woman named Sarah, with a warm smile and patient demeanor, stood at the front of the room, gesturing to a PowerPoint presentation today. "We're going to talk about the importance of empathy in our work." Sarah explained, her voice gentle but firm. "Understanding the perspectives of those we serve is crucial to build trust in our communities." Jerry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, fighting the urge to roll his eyes. He glanced around the room, noting the attentive faces of his fellow officers. How could they buy into this nonsense? Sarah continued, "We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. It's important to recognize and address these biases to ensure fair treatment for everyone in our community." Jerry's jaw clenched. He didn't have biases. He treated everyone the same with SUSP suspicion until proven innocent. That was just good policing, wasn't it? As Sarah moved on to discuss racial biases, specifically, Jerry felt his defenses rise even higher. He wasn't racist. He'd arrested people of all colors. This whole training felt like a personal attack on his character, and his years of service building relationships with community members is key to effective policing. Sarah emphasized, when people trust us, they're more likely to cooperate and help us keep the neighborhood safe." Jerry couldn't hold back anymore. He raised his hand, his face set in a scowl with all due respect. "Ma'am, how are we supposed to do our jobs if we're always second-guessing ourselves? Sometimes you have to make quick decisions based on what you see." Sarah nodded, acknowledging his question. "That's a valid concern, officer, but part of what we're learning here is how to make those quick decisions without relying on harmful stereotypes or assumptions." Jerry shook his head unconvinced as the session continued. He found himself tuning out more and more in his mind. This training was nothing but a waste of time. He knew how to do his job, and no amount of feel-good talk about empathy was going to change that. By the time the session ended, Jerry was more than ready to leave. He gathered his things quickly, avoiding eye contact with Sarah and his fellow officers. As he walked out of the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that this whole ordeal was unfair and unnecessary. The following days, as the training session progressed, Jerry found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable. The instructor, Sarah, moved on to a new topic: implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Sarah explained, her voice calm and non-judgmental. "It's important to recognize that everyone has these biases, even if we don't realize it." Jerry shifted in his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He couldn't help but feel defensive. He'd always prided himself on being fair and impartial. The idea that he might have hidden biases seemed ridiculous to him. Sarah continued, "These biases can affect our decision-making, especially in high-stress situations for police officers. This can lead to unfair treatment of certain groups, even when we don't intend it," as Sarah shared examples of how implicit bias could manifest in policing. Jerry felt a knot forming in his stomach. Some of the scenarios she described sounded uncomfortably familiar, "Remember," Sarah said, looking around the room. "Acknowledging our biases doesn't make us bad people. It's the first step in becoming better officers and serving our community more effectively." Jerry's mind wandered to the incident with Natalie. He had been so sure she was up to no good, but now a tiny seed of doubt began to take root in his mind. Had he really assessed the situation fairly? Or had he jumped to conclusions based on what her appearance, the color of her skin? The thought made him squirm. He didn't want to believe he could be capable of such unfairness. Yet as the session continued, Jerry found it harder and harder to dismiss the instructor's words entirely. By the end of the training, Jerry left feeling conflicted. Part of him still wanted to reject everything he'd heard, to cling to the belief that he was always right in his judgments. But another part, a growing part, wondered if there might be some truth to what the instructors were teaching. As he walked to his car, Jerry couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he needed to take a closer look at his own actions and assumptions. The next day of training brought a new challenge for Jerry: role-playing exercises. Sarah, the instructor, explained that they would be stepping into the shoes of marginalized individuals to better understand their experiences today. "We'll be doing some rule reversal," Sarah announced. "Each of you will take turns playing the role of a civilian in various scenarios." Jerry's stomach tightened. He didn't like the sound of this at all. In the first exercise, Jerry was assigned the role of a young black man being stopped by the police for a routine traffic check. As he acted out the scene with another officer playing the cop, Jerry felt a growing unease. The officer in the scenario spoke to him harshly, demanding to see his license and registration. Without explanation, Jerry found himself stumbling over his words, feeling intimidated and confused. "How does this make you feel?" Sarah asked. After the scene ended, Jerry hesitated. I felt powerless," he admitted reluctantly, "like I was guilty before I even opened my mouth. As the exercises continued, Jerry found himself in various roles: a Hispanic woman being questioned about her citizenship status, an elderly Asian man accused of shoplifting, a Muslim teenager detained at an airport. With each scenario, Jerry felt a growing discomfort. The fear, the frustration, the helplessness, these emotions were new to him. At least from this perspective, he began to see how even small actions or words from an authority figure could leave a lasting impact during a break. Jerry found himself thinking about Natalie. He remembered the fear in her eyes when he had approached her the way she had tried to explain herself, but couldn't get the words out. For the first time, he truly considered how she must have felt in that moment. As the day went on, Jerry's initial resistance began to crumble. He found himself participating more actively, asking questions, and genuinely trying to understand the perspectives being presented by the end of the session. Jerry felt drained, but also strangely enlightened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within him. The certainty he had always felt about his actions as a police officer was no longer as solid as it once was during a break from the training. Jerry stepped out into the hallway, his mind swirling with new perspectives. He leaned against the wall, sipping water from a paper cup, when he overheard two fellow officers chatting nearby. "Did you hear about the Helping Hands charity they're doing?" "Amazing work," one officer said. "Oh yeah, I volunteered there last week," the other replied. "It's run by this incredible family. They provide meals for so many underprivileged folks in our community." Jerry's ears perked up, curious about this local charity he'd never heard of before. "The mother and daughter who run it are so dedicated," the first officer continued. "I think the girl's name is Natalie. She's only 9, but she's always there helping out." Jerry froze, the cup slipping from his fingers and spilling water on the floor. Natalie. It couldn't be the same. Natalie, could it? "Yeah, Caroline and Natalie," the second officer confirmed. "They started it after Caroline's mother passed away. It's their way of giving back to the community that supported them during tough times." Jerry's heart sank as the realization hit him. It was the same family, the very family he had wrongfully targeted. The little girl he had accused of stealing was dedicating her time to feeding those in need. The mother he had argued with was running a charity that helped countless families overwhelmed with shame. Jerry slumped against the wall. He thought about how he had treated them, how he had jumped to conclusions based on nothing but his own biases, and now learning about their selfless work in the community. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him. The conversation between the officers continued, but Jerry could barely hear them over the sound of his own racing thoughts. He had been so wrong, so terribly wrong, not just in his actions that day, but in his entire approach to policing. Jerry couldn't shake the revelation about Natalie and Caroline's charity. He found himself searching for more information during his lunch break, his fingers trembling as he typed Helping Hands Charity into his phone. The charity's website popped up, filled with heartwarming stories and pictures of smiling families. As Jerry scrolled through, his eyes widened. He recognized some of the faces neighbors he'd grown up with, families he'd seen struggle. Then a memory hit him like a punch to the gut. He remembered a Christmas when he was just a boy, maybe 7 or 8. His father had lost his job and his mother was sick. They didn't have much, but on Christmas Eve, a box appeared on their doorstep. It was filled with a turkey, canned goods, and even a small toy for Jerry. At the time, his parents had told him it was from Santa's helpers, but now, staring at the Helping Hands logo, a pair of hands cradling a heart, Jerry realized the truth. It had been this charity, Caroline and Natalie's charity. Tears welled up in Jerry's eyes as the weight of his actions came crashing down on him. The family he had wronged, the little girl he had accused of stealing. They were part of an organization that had once helped his own family in their time of need. Jerry's hands shook as he set down his phone. He felt sick to his stomach. How could he have been so blind? So quick to judge the kindness of strangers had kept his family fed during their darkest times, and he had repaid that kindness with suspicion and cruelty. The enormity of his mistake overwhelmed him. Jerry put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had forgotten where he came from. Forgotten the struggle of his own childhood in his quest to be a good cop. He had lost touch with the very community he was supposed to protect and serve. Jerry sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He stared at the framed photo of himself in his police uniform, once a source of pride, now a stark reminder of how far he had strayed from his true values. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to the Christmas when that mysterious box of food appeared on their doorstep. He remembered the joy on his parents' faces, the relief in their eyes that act of kindness had meant everything to them. What happened to me? Jerry whispered, his voice cracking with the emotion he had joined the force to help people to make a difference in his community. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that goal. The image of Natalie's terrified face flashed before him. Her big, innocent eyes filled with tears as he roughly handcuffed her tiny wrists. Jerry's stomach churned with guilt and shame. I was wrong. He admitted out loud, his voice barely audible. It was the first time he had said those words since the incident. I was so wrong. Jerry's eyes welled up with tears as he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions. He had hurt an innocent child, caused pain to a family that had dedicated their lives to helping others, the same family that had once helped his own. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had become the very thing he had sworn to protect people from, a bully with a badge. Jerry's shoulders shook as he sobbed, years of pent-up emotions finally breaking through his tough exterior. As the tears flowed, Jerry felt something shift inside him. The walls of denial and defensiveness he had built up over the years began to crumble for the first time. In a long time, he allowed himself to truly feel remorse, to feel empathy, to feel the pain he had caused others. I'm sorry, he whispered, though there was no one there to hear him. I'm so sorry. The next day, Jerry stood outside the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. The bright sign above the entrance read, Caroline's Kitchen, feeding hope. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. This was it, the moment he would face the consequences of his actions head on. With shaky hands, Jerry pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell of fresh bread and simmering soup filled the air. Volunteers bustled about, carrying trays and chatting cheerfully. For a moment, Jerry felt out of place in his casual clothes, so different from his usual uniform. A friendly-looking woman approached him. "Can I help you?" she asked with a warm smile. Jerry swallowed hard. "I'm here to volunteer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If that's okay," the woman's eyes lit up. "Of course, we always need extra hands. I'm Susan. Let me show you around." As Susan led him through the kitchen, Jerry's eyes darted nervously around the room. He half expected to see Caroline or Natalie, dreading their reaction if they spotted him. But so far, there was no sign of them. "Here's where we pre the meals," Susan explained, gesturing to a long table covered in vegetables. "Think you can handle some chopping?" Jerry nodded, grateful for the simple task. He picked up a knife and began slicing carrots, his movements mechanical as his mind raced. What would he say if he ran into Natalie's family? Would they even let him stay once they recognized him? As he worked, Jerry overheard snippets of conversation around him. People talked about the families they were helping, the difference these meals made in people's lives. With each story, the weight of his mistake pressed heavier on his shoulders. "You're doing great," Susan said, startling Jerry out of his thoughts. She handed him a hairnet and apron. "Why don't you help serve the soup? It's almost time to open the doors." Jerry's hands trembled as he ladled soup into bowls. He kept his head down, focusing on his task, still unsure if he was truly ready to face the people he had wronged. As Jerry ladled soup into bowls, he caught sight of Caroline entering the kitchen. His heart skipped a beat, and he nearly spilled the soup he was holding. Caroline's eyes met his for a brief moment before she quickly looked away, her expression a mix of surprise and discomfort. Jerry's cheeks burned with shame, but he forced himself to keep working. He could feel the tension in the air as Caroline moved to the far end of the serving line, clearly trying to avoid him. Days passed, and Jerry continued to show up at the community center. Each time he worked diligently, chopping vegetables, mopping floors, or serving food. Caroline and her husband remained distant, barely acknowledging his presence. The guilt weighed heavily on Jerry, but he was determined to prove that he was truly sorry one afternoon. As Jerry was stacking cans in the pantry, he overheard Caroline talking to another volunteer. "I just don't know what to make of him being here," Caroline said softly, after what he did to Natalie. "Maybe he's trying to make amends," the other volunteer suggested. Jerry's heart raped. He wanted to explain, to apologize, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he focused on his task, carefully arranging the cans with trembling hands. As the weeks went by, Jerry noticed small changes. Caroline no longer went out of her way to avoid him. Sometimes he caught her watching him with a thoughtful expression. Her husband even nodded at Jerry one day as they passed each other in the hallway, one day as Jerry was struggling to carry a heavy box of donations. Caroline's husband approached him. "Need a hand with that?" he asked, his voice neutral but not unkind. Jerry nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sir," together. They carried the box to the storage room. As they set it down, Caroline's husband turned to Jerry. "You've been here every day for weeks now," he said, studying Jerry's face. Why, Jerry took a deep breath. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice shaking. "I hurt your family, and I can never undo that. But I want to try to make things right, even if it's just in some small way." Caroline's husband was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Slowly, I see," he said. "Well, we could use help sorting these donations. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet." But as they worked side by side, Jerry felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was on the path to making things right. As Jerry finished his shift at the community center one evening, he found himself face to face with Caroline and her husband. The air grew thick with tension as they stood in the empty dining area. "Officer Jerry," Caroline said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "We need to talk." Jerry's heart raced, but he nodded, knowing this moment was inevitable. "Of course," he replied softly. Caroline's husband spoke next, his eyes fixed on Jerry. "We've seen you here every day working hard, but we need to understand, why did you target our daughter?" That day, Jerry felt a lump form in his throat. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. I made a terrible mistake," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw Natal alone outside the store, I jumped to conclusions. I assumed the worst. Without even trying to understand the situation, tears welled up in Jerry's eyes as he continued. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I saw a child of color and immediately thought she must be up to no good. I was so focused on enforcing rules that I forgot to be human." Caroline's eyes glistened with unshed tears. As she listened, her husband placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Jerry's voice cracked as he went on. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong. I've spent every day since then realizing how much harm I caused, not just to Natalie, but to your whole family. I let my prejudices guide my actions, and I failed in my duty to protect and serve." He looked directly at Caroline and her husband, his face etched with remorse. "I am truly deeply sorry for the pain I caused your family. Natalie didn't deserve that treatment. No child does. I know my words can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing, to being better." Caroline and her husband stood in silence for a moment, absorbing Jerry's words. The sincerity in his voice and the tears in his eyes spoke volumes. Caroline took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you for your honesty, officer." "Jerry," she said, her voice gentle but still guarded. "It means a lot to hear." "You acknowledge your mistake," her husband nodded in agreement. "We've seen how hard you've been working here at the charity. It's clear you're trying to make amends." Jerry wiped his eyes, relief washing over him. He hadn't expected forgiveness, but their willingness to listen meant more than he could express. Caroline continued. "What happened to Natalie? It's not something we can forget easily, but we can see that you're genuinely sorry and want to change." Her husband added, "Change takes time and effort. We appreciate that you're putting in both." Jerry nodded earnestly. "I understand. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing better." Caroline and her husband exchanged a look, seeming to have a silent conversation. After a moment, Caroline turned back to Jerry. "We'd like you to continue volunteering here," she said. "If you're serious about making things right, this is a good place to start." Jerry's eyes widened. In surprise, really. "You'd let me stay?" Caroline's husband nodded. "Actions speak louder than words, Officer Jerry. We're giving you a chance to show us, and the community, that you mean what you say." Jerry felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise I won't let you down." Caroline managed a small smile. "We hope not. This charity means a lot to us and to the community. Your help is appreciated, and it's a step towards healing," as they prepared to leave. Caroline added, "And Officer Jerry, maybe one day, when Natalie feels ready, you can apologize to her too. But that's her choice, and we won't rush her." Jerry nodded solemnly. "Of course, I understand completely." "Thank you for this opportunity." Jerry continued to volunteer at the charity, showing up every week without fail. At first, the atmosphere was tense, with weary glances and hushed whispers following him wherever he went. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to change. One afternoon, Jerry was sorting through donated clothes when an elderly woman approached him. Her eyes were kind, but her face showed the wear of a hard life. "You're that officer, aren't you?" she asked softly. Jerry nodded, his cheeks flushing with shame. "Yes, ma'am, I am." To his surprise, she patted his arm gently. "It takes courage to face your mistakes, young man. I've seen you working hard here. Keep it up." Her words touched Jerry deeply. He realized that the community he had once viewed with suspicion was full of compassionate, resilient people. As time went on, Jerry found himself chatting with the families who came for meals. He listened to their stories, tales of job loss, medical bills, and unexpected hardships. Each conversation chipped away at his preconceptions. One day, a young boy came in with his mother. The child's shoes were worn thin, and Jerry couldn't help but remember his own childhood struggles. Without hesitation, he found a pair of sneakers in the donation pile that would fit the boy. "Here you go, buddy," Jerry said, handing them over with a smile. The boy's face lit up, and his mother's eyes filled with grateful tears. Caroline witnessed this interaction from across the room. She approached Jerry afterward, a thoughtful look on her face. "You're really changing, aren't you?" she asked. Jerry nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'm trying being here. It's opened my eyes to so much." Caroline smiled softly. "I can see that you know when you first started coming here. I wasn't sure if you were serious about making amends, but now I think you really are." Her words meant more to Jerry than she could know. He was beginning to see the world and his role in it in a whole new light. The badge he once wore as a symbol of authority now felt like a responsibility to protect and serve in a much deeper way. The following week, Jerry stood on the porch of Natalie and Caroline's home. His heart pounding in his chest, he took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house, and Jerry felt his palms grow sweaty as he waited. Caroline opened the door, her expression guarded but not unkind. "Officer." "Jerry," she said softly, "please come in." Jerry stepped inside. "Remove." Moving his hat as he entered the living room was cozy and warm, filled with family photos and colorful artwork. Natalie sat on the couch, her eyes wide as she looked at Jerry. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Jerry said, his voice thick with emotion. He sat down in an armchair across from Natalie and Caroline, who had taken a seat next to her daughter. Jerry cleared his throat and looked directly at Natalie. "Natalie, I want to apologize to you for what happened that day at the grocery store. I made a terrible mistake, and I hurt you. I'm so sorry for scaring you and for not listening to you when you tried to explain." Natalie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded silently. Jerry then turned to Caroline. "And to you, Caroline. I want to apologize for the pain and distress I caused your family. My actions were wrong, and I deeply regret them. I've learned so much since then about my own biases and the importance of truly serving and protecting our community." Caroline's expression softened as she listened to Jerry's heartfelt words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes and hear the tremor in his voice. "I know I can't undo what happened," Jerry continued, "but I want you both to know that I'm committed to doing better. I'm working hard to change, to be the kind of officer this community deserves." Caroline reached out and placed her hand on Jerry's arm. "Thank you, Jerry," she said softly. "Your apology means a lot to us. We can see how hard you've been working at the charity, and we appreciate your efforts to make things right." Natalie, who had been quiet until now, spoke up in a small voice. "Do you really mean it that you're sorry?" Jerry nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I do, Natalie. I'm so sorry." And then Natalie looked at her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then to Jerry. Surprised, Natalie stood up and gave him a quick hug. "I forgive you," she whispered. Jerry felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he gently returned the hug. When Natalie stepped back, he saw Caroline wiping away a tear. "We accept your apology," Jerry Caroline said, "and we appreciate you coming here to talk to us. It's a big step towards rebuilding trust." As word of Jerry's volunteer work spread through the police station, his colleagues began to take notice. At first, many were skeptical, unsure if Jerry's change of heart was genuine or just a ploy to save his career. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in their once rigid co-worker officer, Mina Thompson, who had always found Jerry's by-the-book approach frustrating, was one of the first to recognize the change she watched. As Jerry arrived at the station one morning, a warm smile on his face as he greeted the custodian by name. "Morning, Jerry," Mina said, curiosity getting the better of her. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time at that local charity. How's that going?" Jerry's eyes lit up. "It's been eye-opening, Mina. I never realized how much impact a simple act of kindness could have on our community." As Jerry shared stories about the families he'd met and the connections he'd made, Mina found herself drawn in. She had never seen this side of Jerry before, compassionate, humble, and genuinely invested in the well-being of others. Word of Jerry's transformation spread quickly through the department. Some officers, like Detective Mike Roberts, remained skeptical. "People don't change that easily," Mike grumbled during a staff meeting. "He's just trying to save face," but others were intrigued. Officer Tom Chen, a rookie who had always felt uncomfortable with the department's aggressive tactics, approached Jerry one afternoon. "Hey, Jerry," he said hesitantly. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about that sensitivity training you went through. It sounds interesting." Jerry smiled warmly. "Of course, Tom, I'd be happy to share what I've learned. It's changed the way I see our role in the community." As Jerry spoke about implicit bias and the importance of building trust, a small group of officers gathered around, listening intently. Even Mike, despite his initial skepticism, found himself drawn into the conversation. By the end of the week, Jerry's influence had begun to ripple through the department. Officers were discussing community outreach initiatives during their breaks, and Sarah had even suggested implementing a mentorship program for at-risk youth. Jerry's heart raced as he walked into the police station. It had been weeks since he'd last worn his uniform, and the weight of uncertainty hung heavy on his shoulders as he approached Chief's office. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever news awaited him. "Come in, Jerry," the chief called out, his voice neutral. Jerry stepped inside, his posture straight, but his eyes betraying a mix of hope and apprehension. "You wanted to see me, sir?" The chief nodded, gesturing for Jerry to take a seat. "I've been reviewing your case. Jerry, the investigation into the incident with young Natalie has concluded." Jerry's throat tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for the verdict. "I have to say I've been impressed by your actions over the past few weeks. Chief continued your volunteer work at the charity, your commitment to making amends. It shows a level of growth I wasn't sure you were capable of." A glimmer of hope flickered in Jerry's chest, but he dared not let it show after careful consideration. "I've decided to reinstate you to active duty," the chief announced. Relief washed over Jerry, but before he could respond, The captain held up a hand. "However, there are conditions," he said firmly. "Your reinstatement comes with the required M for ongoing community involvement. We want to ensure that this growth continues." Jerry nodded eagerly. "Of course, sir. I'm more than willing to continue my work with the charity. And it's more than that." Jerry the chief interrupted. "We implementing a new community outreach program, and I want you to be a part of it. You'll be required to attend monthly sensitivity training sessions and participate in community events. Additionally, you'll be partnered with Officer Thompson to lead youth engagement initiatives." Jerry felt a mix of excitement and nervousness at the prospect. It was more than he had expected, but he knew it was an opportunity to continue making a difference. "I understand," Sir Jerry replied, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let you down." The chief's stern expression softened slightly. "I believe you, Jerry. This is your chance to be the kind of officer our community needs. Don't waste it." As Jerry left the office, his reinstated badge feeling both familiar and new, in his hand he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his career, one focused on building bridges and fostering understanding in the community he had sworn to protect and serve. As the weeks passed, Jerry continued his work with the charity and his community outreach efforts. He often saw Natalie there, but she would always shy away, hiding behind her mother or busying herself with tasks far from where he was working. Jerry understood her hesitation and respected her space, focusing instead on proving himself through his actions. One sunny afternoon, as Jerry was helping to sort through donated clothes, he noticed Natalie struggling with a heavy box of canned goods. Without thinking, he rushed over to help her here. "Let me give you a hand with that," Jerry said softly, careful not to startle here. Natalie looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment she seemed unsure, but then she nodded slightly together. They carried the box to its destination. As they worked side by side, Jerry noticed Natalie sneaking glances at him. He offered her a gentle smile, and to his amazement, she returned it with a small one of her own. From that day on, Natalie's weariness began to fade. She no longer avoided Jerry at the charity event, and sometimes she even sought him out for help with tasks. Jerry always made sure to be patient and kind, showing her that he was there to support her. As time went on, Natalie's trust in Jerry grew. She started to ask him questions about his job and his life, her natural curiosity. Overcoming her initial fear, Jerry answered honestly, often sharing stories that made her giggle or gasp in wonder. One day, as they were planting flowers in the community garden, Natalie turned to Jerry with a serious look on her face. "Officer Jerry," she said, her voice small but steady. "I used to be scared of you, but now I think you're nice." Jerry felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Natalie," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot to me. I'm sorry I scared you before, and I promise to always be someone you can trust." Natalie nodded, a bright smile spreading across her face. From that moment on, their bond deepened. Jerry became a mentor figure to Natalie, offering guidance and support whenever she needed it. He helped her with homework, taught her about safety, and even showed her how to ride a bike. As their relationship grew, Jerry realized that Natalie had not only forgiven him, but had also taught him invaluable lessons about innocence, trust, and the power of second chances. Her openness and willingness to see the good in him inspired Jerry to continue his journey of growth and community service. As summer approached, Natalie's family began planning their annual community charity event this year. However, they had a special idea in mind. Caroline, Natalie's mother, approached Jerry one afternoon at the charity center. "Jerry, we've been thinking." She began, a warm smile on her face. "We'd like you to help us organize this year's event. We want to focus on bringing together law enforcement and local residents." Jerry's eyes widened. In surprise, "Really, you want me to help?" Caroline nodded. "We've seen how much you've changed, and we think you could make a real difference," touched by their trust in him. Jerry eagerly agreed. He saw this as an opportunity to not only contribute to the community, but also to help mend the strained relationship between the police and local residents. Over the next few weeks, Jerry threw himself into the planning process. He worked closely with Natalie's family, brainstorming ideas to make the event both fun and meaningful. They decided on a picnic-style gathering in the local park with activities that would encourage interaction between officers and community members. Jerry reached out to his colleagues at the police station, encouraging them to participate. Some were hesitant at first, but Jerry's enthusiasm was contagious. He shared his own experiences of personal growth and the positive impact of community involvement. "This is our chance to show we're more than just uniforms." Jerry told his fellow officers we can build real connections with the people we serve as the day of the event. Drew, near Jerry, found himself working side by side with Natalie, making colorful posters to hang around the park. He couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. "Are you excited about the picnic?" Jerry asked as they painted. Natalie nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I can't wait to see all the police officers playing games with everyone. It's going to be so much fun." Jerry smiled, touched by her excitement. He realized that this event wasn't just about repairing relationships between adults. It was also about showing children like Natalie that police officers could be trusted, friends and protectors. The day of the charity event arrived, and the local park buzzed with excitement. Jerry arrived early, his heart racing. With a mix of nervousness and anticipation, he watched as families began to trickle in their faces, curious and somewhat hesitant as more police officers showed up in casual clothes. Jerry greeted them warmly, encouraging them to mingle with the community members. He had organized a variety of activities designed to break the ice and foster positive interactions at the center of the park. A large banner hung between two trees reading, "Community Unity Picnic." Below it, Jerry had set up a face-painting station where officers and residents took turns painting each other's FA with colorful designs. Natalie's laughter rang out as she convinced a burly officer to let her paint a butterfly on his cheek. The sight of the tough-looking cop with a delicate butterfly on his face brought smiles to everyone around. Jerry moved from group to group, making introductions and encouraging conversations. He noticed how the initial awkwardness began to melt away as people shared stories over plates of homemade food. One of the most popular activities was the dunk tank. Jerry had volunteered to be the first officer in the seat, and a long line of community members formed, eager for a chance to dunk him as he plunged into the water. Time after time, Jerry's good-natured laughter echoed across the park, setting a tone of lightheartedness and fun. Caroline approached Jerry as he was toweling off. "This is amazing, Jerry," she said, her eyes shining. "Look around. I never thought I'd see something like this in our community." Jerry followed her gaze, taking in the scene. Officers were pushing kids on swings. Teenagers were teaching cops how to do trendy dances. And everywhere he looked, people were talking and laughing together. "It's all thanks to you and your family." Jerry replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a second chance. You showed me what community really means." As the afternoon wore on, Jerry noticed a change in the atmosphere. The initial tension had completely disappeared, replaced by a sense of warmth and camaraderie. He overheard snippets of conversations where officers and residents were exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet up again. The event was more than just a success. It was a turning point. Jerry could feel it in his bones. This day marked the beginning of a new chapter 1, where the police and the community worked together, understood each other, and built a foundation of trust and cooperation. As the weeks passed, following the successful charity event, Jerry found himself spending more and more time with Natalie's family. What had begun as a gesture of making amends had blossomed into a genuine friendship that touched his heart in ways he never expected. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Jerry sat on the porch of Natalie's family home, sipping lemonade and watching Natalie play with her friends in the front yard. Caroline joined him, settling into the chair beside him with a contented sigh. "You know, Jerry," she said, her voice warm, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you're a part of our lives now." Jerry felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Caroline, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "I can't tell you how much that means to me," he replied softly. "Your family has changed my life in ways I never imagined possible." As he sat there, Jerry's mind wandered back to the day of the incident. He remembered the anger, the defensiveness, the certainty that he was right. It felt like a lifetime ago now. As he watched Natalie laugh and play, he marveled at how different he had become. "I was so caught up in my own biases," Jerry admitted, shaking his head. "I thought I was doing my job, but I was just perpetuating harm. Your family showed me what true community looks like." Caroline reached out and squeezed his hand. "We all make mistakes, Jerry. What matters is how we learn from them and grow." Jerry Barr nodded, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. He thought about the family dinners he'd been invited to, the movie nights, where Natalie insisted he sit next to her, the long conversations with Caroline and her husband about life, community, and second chances. "I'm just so grateful," Jerry said, his voice thick with emotion. "You could have shut me out, but instead you welcomed me in. You've taught me more about empathy and understanding than any training ever could." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Jerry realized how much his life had changed. He was no longer just Officer Jerry, the strict cop who saw threats around every corner. He was Jerry, a friend, a mentor, and a valued member of this community. As Jerry returned to active duty, he approached his work with a newfound perspective. The lessons he'd learned from Natalie's family and his time volunteering had profoundly changed him. He now saw the community he served through a different lens, one tinted with empathy and understanding. On his first day back on patrol, Jerry encountered a situation that would have once led him to make a hasty judgment. A young man was loitering outside a convenience store, looking nervous. The old Jerry would have immediately assumed the worst, but now he paused and took a different approach. "Hey there, Jerry," called out, his voice friendly. "Everything okay?" The young man looked up, startled. I'm waiting for my mom. She's inside getting medicine for my little sister." Jerry nodded, remembering Natalie's similar explanation. "That's kind of you to wait out here. It's a hot day. Would you like some water?" The young man's tense shoulders relaxed, and he smiled gratefully. "That would be nice. Thank you." As Jerry handed him a bottle of water from his patrol car, he struck up a conversation, learning about the young man's family and their struggles. By the time the boy's mother emerged from the store, Jerry had gained valuable insight into the community he served back at the station. Jerry's colleagues noticed the change in him. Officer Thompson, known for his tough approach, watched curiously as Jerry spoke with genuine interest to a group of teenagers hanging out in the park. "What's gotten into you, Jerry?" Thompson asked later. "You used to be the first one to clear out loiterers." Jerry smiled. "I've learned that sometimes all people need is a chance to be heard. Those kids, they were organizing a community cleanup. Now we're going to help them get permits for it." As the weeks passed, Jerry's new approach began to influence others in the department. He shared stories of his experiences and encouraged his fellow officers to engage more deeply with the community. Some were skeptical at first, but as they saw the positive results of Jerry's methods, they began to change too. One day the chief called Jerry into his office. Jerry entered, wondering if he had done something wrong. "Officer Jerry," the chief began, "I've been hearing a lot about your new approach to community policing. I have to say I'm impressed." Jerry felt a surge of pride. "Thank you, sir. I've learned a lot about the importance of empathy and understanding in our work." The chief nodded. "I'd like you to lead a workshop for the department on your methods. I think we could all benefit from what you've learned." As Jerry left the office, he felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. He was not just enforcing the law, he was helping to build a stronger, more connected community. And it all started with a little girl named Natalie, and a family who taught him the true meaning of second chances. Jerry stood on the porch of Natalie's family home, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The door swung open, and Natalie's bright smile greeted him. "Officer Jerry," she exclaimed. her eyes twinkling. "Come in, everyone's waiting for you." As Jerry stepped inside, the warm aroma of home-cooked food enveloped him. The house buzzed with laughter and chatter. Caroline, Natalie's mother, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jerry, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, giving him a warm hug. "Dinner's almost ready." Jerry followed them into the dining room where the table was set for a feast. Natalie's father, Mark, was placing a steaming dish in the center. "There he is." Mark grinned, clapping Jerry on the shoulder. "Our guest of honor," as they all sat down to eat. Jerry looked around the table in wonder. These people whom he had once wronged so terribly were now treating him like family. The conversation flowed easily, filled with stories, jokes, and shared memories. During a lull in the talk, cleared his throat. "I just want to say thank you, all of you, for giving me a second chance, for teaching me what it really means to serve and protect. You've changed my life." Caroline reached out and squeezed his hand. "Jerry, you've become a part of our family. Your willingness to learn and change has inspired all of us." Natalie piped up, "And you're the best at helping me with my math homework." Everyone laughed, and Jerry felt a warmth spar through his chest. He realized that this family had not only forgiven him, but had welcomed him into their lives completely. As the evening wound down, Jerry helped clear the table, standing in the kitchen with Caroline. He said softly, "I never thought I'd be here. You know, after what I did, I'm just so grateful." Caroline smiled. That's the power of forgiveness. Jerry, and the strength of community. We all grow when we lift each other up. Jerry nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He looked out the window at the quiet neighborhood street, thinking about how different it looked now compared to when he used to patrol it. The future stretched out before him, full of promise and the opportunity for continued growth. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Jerry and Natalie, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.